Thanks, Mitch. Great to be with everybody again, and welcome to another of our Hypes webinar series. Today we're going to be focused on service companies. And I wasn't sure how much interest this would generate, but fantastic to see so many of you interested in this topic. It's a topic that's close to my heart, having worked with and worked for service companies in the past. It's fair to say that innovation is perceived quite differently between companies that make things, product companies, and companies that are servicing other companies. And so we felt it was a topic that was worthy of exploring a little bit more in a little bit more detail. And I'm going to have chance to skim it really today and give you some of the observations that we make working with our 200 clients, the differences and similarities, and where services companies are attempting to innovate, how they're seeing the world, and perhaps drawing some distinctions between companies that are more focused in product. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Colin Nelson. I run the Enterprise Innovation Group at Hype, and I've been working in this industry now for 10 years, supporting companies establish effective and sustainable online innovation programs. Before that, I worked in management consultancy and also in information management. And I have a small team of people who work with about 50 or 60 of our every year on the people and process side of online innovation management. And that topic of innovation management is really becoming a very, very broad conversation. I'm going to talk more about that breadth as we go through today and as we talk about how service companies are using these sorts of applications and tools. So as Mitch said, we'll also take some questions towards the end. Now I know that for many of you this is your first contact with Hype, and you may have some generic questions about the organization and what we do. Feel free to put them in the question box throughout the webinar. But in terms of what we'll deal with today specifically towards the end, we're going to be focusing on this topic alone. But any questions that you do have that are outside of the scope of this particular topic, we will come back to you and endeavor to address them separately. So I'm conscious that for some of you, as I said, this may be your first conversation with Hype, the first time you've heard what we have to say. But I just want to give you a glimpse into my world and my role, and then a little bit on Hype and the sort of company we are before we dive into the meat of today's agenda. So let's start off with my world, sustainable and collaborative enterprise innovation programs. And each of these words are chosen very deliberately. So sustainability is crucial because one-off innovations are not enough. It's not enough to support the growth of our organizations if we're commercial. It's not enough to support the improvements that we need if we're perhaps in the government space. Collaborative, well, it's pretty clear to those that have been in this industry for some time that the concept of a lone inventor generating an invention, being all that innovation is a pretty old hat now. And what we see is real innovation, real creativity comes from teamwork, people working together. So getting people to collaborate, improving upon the ideas and concepts of each other is crucial to this crazy thing we call innovation. Many of you work for large, quite complex organizations. Some of you work within communities. The concept of involving a much wider group of people in innovation, aside from perhaps where we might have traditionally looked in perhaps a new product development team, is becoming much more prevalent. So engaging the whole enterprise, and in many cases beyond the enterprise, to support our innovation programs is certainly helpful in terms of generating more diversity of opinion. However, as soon as we start asking large or diverse groups of people to collaborate online, we do need to start thinking about how we can automate that, and that's where the software comes in. It gives the process and the approach scale, it gives us some rigor, and of course retains all those ideas and insights and knowledge and concepts for future reference. And the reason that perhaps my role exists and my team helps is because, of course, putting software in place does not mean that people share, does not mean people share at a high level of quality. It doesn't mean people share and support this process in a sustainable way. All of those answers are more people related. They're appropriate to our culture, our structure, our objectives. And how I spend my time is working with organizations in that little quadrant there, adapting these programs to meet the sort of objectives that sort of your organizations have. So just in terms of hype, a couple of quick slides. We've been in this business now for 15 years. All we do is online innovation management programs. We're primarily a software company with services to support both the integration of the software, but also the culture change, the change management, and the process training side of things. We're headquartered in Bonn, Germany, but we also have major offices in Boston in the US and in Abu Dhabi, and we're about 80 employees worldwide. We have a variety of products, and the biggest products support the full life cycle of innovation, and our focus is really helping our clients to be successful. So our reason for existing is really to help you. We don't just hand the software out and expect it to work. We really work as more of a partner with our clients to help ensure a successful installation and a successful program, so that over time you get more and more significant results. Software is very flexible, and I'm not going to touch all about the software. This is the only slide I'm going to even mention it, but the software is very flexible. It will adapt to very different types of organizations, very different types of circumstances, and can be installed on-premise or in the cloud. These are the sorts of companies that we work with. This is a snapshot. So we have about 200 or so clients worldwide, and the variety of different use cases is vast. I'm going to pick into 4 very specific examples from the services sector later on, but just to sort of illustrate the point. Some of these organizations just do what I would consider to be crowdsourcing, idea campaigns, generating ideas in the front end of innovation. Some of these companies just operate in the back end. So they're primarily doing innovation portfolio management, managing different concepts through to implementation. Some, of course, do both, and some of these organizations will just implement the program internally, and others will implement the program with a combination of external partners. That could be supply chain, could be customers, could be the general public. So very, very wide range of different use cases according to the different needs that exist. Now, many of these companies here are companies that make things. They're services companies, or they're product companies. But I really want to put that to one side for today, and I want to think about services companies in much more detail. This is our vision. For those of you who haven't seen it before, I'll give it a quick read through just so that everybody's on the same page, and then we can get going. Once organizations have reached a certain size, there's a significant distance between those that have ideas and insights and those that have the power and resources to act upon them. And what we do is to provide both the technology, the processes, and the connect those idea contributors and the decision makers so that we can help organizations grow, make more money, be more efficient, and empower people. And we're going to pick at some of those elements as we go through today. For those of you who are not familiar with an innovation funnel, I want to just present to you Hype's full innovation lifecycle process very quickly, because we're going to come back to this and try and draw some distinctions between how product companies see this and how services companies see this. So if we just focus on the blue areas for the start off with, so we tend to group innovation activities and call them strategic innovation areas. Some of you may call them focus areas or hunting grounds. Essentially, it's a group of innovation activities that may exist both inside a tool and outside. Many of you will be familiar with the concept of idea campaigns, so question-led initiation of idea creation and sharing, collaboration, through to a point of qualifying which content we want to do. And for some organizations that's sufficient. That's a nice chunk of activity that they focus on. Now for others, they need to build an innovation portfolio, a set of concepts that may well be competing with each other for budget and resources, and that's where the back end starts to come into play. This is where we look at business cases, proof of concepts, building up concepts so that we can judge what essentially are the best decisions to make with our different options that we have. And eventually through to innovation projects where we're talking about tracking, implementing tasks and milestones. Now we normally separate that out into the front end and back end of innovation. Those terminologies are loose, they're not necessarily firm, so I don't really mind how you see this, but most of you will recognize, I think, these steps in the process. And then for some of our clients, we also have this early stage wrapper, which integrates trends and insights so that we can inspire people's innovation activities throughout this innovation funnel, and also justify why a particular concept might be good based upon some trends that are happening out there in the market. Now we're going to come back to this towards the end of the presentation. I'm going to look specifically at those the second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth blocks, so strategic innovation areas through to innovation projects, and we'll focus on those blocks and look at how service companies see them. So let's get into the bulk of today's session and think about why are services companies of interest to me? Why do they see innovation in a different way? Why does innovation feel different if you're a services company? And we'll spell out some examples for you. I've got 4 examples just to illustrate different ways in which organizations are looking at this. And then we'll provide you with some recommendations and some tips and tricks towards the end in terms of if you are a services company and you're interested in establishing online innovation programs, and hopefully that's of use to you. So I think the majority of this content is going to be valuable for people who are relatively early on in this process in the services sector, but for many of you there might be some interesting as well. So let's just set the scene, and I want to go back in time. I first entered this industry about 10 years ago, and at that time the companies that were primarily investing in engaging their communities in innovation were typically companies that made products. And those companies, there was something about this particular technique that made this type of process attractive to them. And I want to dig into that a little bit. I want to understand what their innovation environment was, looking at maybe a window of about 7 to 10 years ago. Because at that time, relatively few services companies were doing this kind of work. And we're seeing a big change in that now. And I want to look back before we start looking forward in terms of what did we learn through that journey and what can we now take forward. So these are 5 of the most common investors in this sector. So consumer goods, food and beverage companies, heavy engineering, so that might include automotive and aerospace, perhaps transportation, chemicals companies, and pharmaceutical companies. Now all of these companies make products, and there are some other things that they have in common. They're all relatively heavily regulated industries, obviously for good reasons. We want to make sure that the food that we're eating is safe. We want to make sure that the planes that we fly on are safe. We want to make sure that the drugs that we take are suitable for us. They also have, in many cases, relatively long product development cycles. So pharma, for example, might be 13 to 15 years for a successful drug from inception through to implementation, maybe even longer. Consumer goods, of course, will be much, much shorter than that, but there's still a good period of time where we're developing something new. So these were the sort of 5 major sectors that I saw back 10 years ago, primarily investing in this space. And the question occurred to me, what is it about this process of online innovation, of getting larger diverse groups of people sharing and collaborating on our innovation challenges? What was it that made this attractive? Why was it helpful? And there are a few things that I took away from that. The first one was that many of these companies were relatively large, and they often had thousands of employees in locations all around the world. So scale was definitely a big determining factor. They all had relatively strong experience in what I call sustained product innovation. So companies that were making new capabilities, new products day after day. And the logic was, well, at some point in time, the products that we make today eventually will become less popular, the market will overtake us, and we need to replace them with something. So it really felt like new product development was part of the day job for these sorts of companies. And because of that, they had very established, well-worn innovation processes, and often quite expensive product development cycles due to, in many cases, regulation. So if we look at the pharma experience, there are many stages, many gates, many steps in that process which are heavily regulated. And so, of course, that slows everything down, and that's nothing wrong with that, but what it meant was it's expensive to take a product from inception through to implementation. And I think some of these insights are quite helpful as we move forward in understanding their innovation environment. In many cases, these were quite competitive environments for a variety of reasons. Consumer goods, food and beverages, those markets move very fast. And so if you stop innovating, then your competition will very quickly take you over you. In many cases, we spoke about regulation, phase gate processes to control the innovation program. When it costs a lot to take an idea from inception through to implementation, it's very important that we're making the right decisions. And so often the portfolio management piece of the puzzle is really crucial, because if we're investing in things that aren't going to maximize benefits, then of course we're reducing the level of impact that we can have. Another aspect that I think often goes overlooked, but many of these companies also had relatively well-established continuous improvement programs. So if you think about automotive or aerospace, often heavily invested in Lean and Six Sigma, keen on operational excellence and making sure every step in the process is as efficient as possible. Again, because it takes so long to take a product to market, it's very important that we minimize the amount of money that we spend getting there. And one of the reasons that that's quite interesting is that often it was quite common to invite employees to share ideas on how things could be improved. And what you'll see, of course, is the DNA of that is now become much more prevalent. So it's much more common for us to invite employees to share and collaborate on new ideas and concepts. But this really started from more of a continuous improvement perspective. And of course, if you're experienced in sharing ideas in a continuous improvement environment, it's much easier to transfer that behavior into an innovation space later. And the other thing that I think was quite interesting is that acquisitions were a key part of many of these company strategies, particularly in food and beverage, particularly in pharma. Not all the best ideas were coming from yours, and so to acquire companies, smaller organizations to add to your portfolio was quite common. So what this sort of tended to create was, in some cases, a bit of an imbalance between organic and non-organic growth, but equally it also created new pockets of people that could be tapped in for the benefits of collective insight. Now, some of these environmental aspects exist in the services companies and some don't. We'll draw that into a conclusion in a second. But what I took from this experience was that back sort of 7 to 10 years ago, large complex multinationals really did see the benefits of harnessing the collective insight of their employees without taking them away from the day job. And they were comfortable in transitioning that to a software platform and allowing people to participate at a time of their leisure. It was also important to improve the fuzzy front end of innovation. Because they were spending so much money on taking a new product to market, it was very crucial that anything that went into that innovation funnel was at the highest possible quality and maximize the opportunity for differentiation. Organic growth is often used to complement acquisitions, sure, but perhaps there was an imbalance in some organizations, and perhaps some of them saw that they weren't really getting enough out of their own employees and were depending too heavily on expensive acquisitions. So this was sort of my takeaways, which I think we're now going to sort of link back to as we start focusing on services companies and see where the commonalities and differences are, and perhaps begin to learn some lessons about why is it that services companies now are beginning to be much more interested in this online innovation stuff. So let's move on to focusing on services companies specifically and have a think about why innovation may be perceived differently from their perspective. So let's look at what's different about a services company. Well, there's some obvious stuff. The main resource, of course, is people and not necessarily products. It's intellectual property, it's knowledge, it's insights. We're trading on a different commodity. And in many cases, that means that they're quite dynamic organizations. They can shift much more quickly. They don't necessarily need to have, not necessarily burdened with heavy regulation in the same way that some of those other sectors are. Now, some aspects of the services sectors, of course, have regulation, but I think if we do a compare and contrast, I think it's much less. In many cases, there is very little history of systematic new capability creation as a method of staying alive. You could continue to sort of just incrementally change and adapt because you can be a bit more nimble. And so for the compelling reason to act of a vast change in the competitive landscape or real competitors pushing you all the time, didn't really create that same sort of momentum for services companies to feel like they had to do something drastically different. And the other thing, of course, is that continuous improvement was not necessarily widely adopted in many of those, in many of the service sectors that we're now working within. So perhaps less of a history of inviting people to share their ideas on how things can be improved and what else we could do. But something's changed because now we're seeing financial services companies, IT services companies, construction companies, government healthcare, business services, logistics companies, these organizations that really aren't product companies, that really are much more service orientated in many cases, adopting these same principles. So something has changed, and it's interesting just to explore what that might be. Well, the first thing I would observe is that we learned quite a bit through the journey of working with product companies. One of the things we observed is actually collective insight has much wider benefits than just product innovation. The techniques of collective insight, like idea campaigns, are applicable to any sort of collaboration challenge. It's simply the best way of getting large or diverse groups of people to work together online. And I'm not sure necessarily 10 years ago everybody really had that clear in their minds. It certainly wasn't clear in mine. What I'd also observe is that geographically distributed companies have collaboration problems. And those collaboration problems manifest themselves in the innovation space, but also in the efficiency space. So how do we share best practices well? How do we improve our processes? How do we make an incremental improvement on a new capability using the best minds that we have when they're actually spread all over the world in different time zones? So again, scale coming back into the equation. And I think the final observation I'd make is that the pace of change is increasing, and every company recognizes this. There's lots of good writing on pace of change. And what that's leading organizations towards of all types is trying to develop what we call dynamic capability. And if you're interested in that phrase, look at the writings and John Besant from Exeter University. He presented a global forum back in Bonn in May, and I think a lot of people took quite a lot of content from that. This concept of dynamic capability, having a dynamically flexible organization that can pivot according to changes in external circumstances, is really fascinating. And in many cases, some services companies kind of already had that. Perhaps more product companies didn't. But I think companies of all types now are recognizing that this is important. So what kinds of challenges are these services industries actually attacking? What are they looking at? Well, certainly the creation of new capabilities. So, all right, if we can't draw a direct correlation to product and service, then we can draw a similarity between capability and product. So, yes, of course, services companies are interested in creating new capabilities, and we'll run through some examples of those a little bit later. Addressing some I would consider to be knowledge management collaboration problems like sharing best practices. What have we done elsewhere that could be replicated, not reinventing the wheel? It reminds me of a company called Edenred, a French business services company, where they found that they had many different operating companies all in different countries, and they all had a slightly different flavor of focus, but there was a lot of similarities there. There really wasn't a good way, if I was in one location, to be able to understand what was happening in other locations. And so what Edenred did was spend a lot of time just sourcing really good examples of things that have been done, new capabilities that have been created from one market, centralizing them, and then curating them and making them available to everybody else across the organization, with the express purpose of replication of best practice. And what they found was about 30% of all initiatives created across the organization, it was about 260 so they were tracking, were replicated at least in one other core market, which is a massive efficiency improvement, not to mention a great growth driver. So sharing best practices has big benefits, and if those of you that were at a forum in Bonn in May will have also heard Transdev talking about something very similar. Cost reduction never goes out of fashion, and it doesn't matter what kind of company you are. Everybody wants to make sure we're as efficient as possible when it comes to cost. And process improvements. How do we get our employees to tell us which processes we should change to make us better in a variety of different ways? One example springs to mind from Equinity, so a business services company. They found that their call center staff, which numbered about 300, were frustrated that they just weren't doing things in an efficient way. And there simply had been no conversation, no real forum for this group of people to actually share how things could be improved, how we could take away bottlenecks. And they presented at a London forum last year and shared all kinds of different examples from these 300 where they saw and observed huge improvements that could be made with very simple quick win changes. So engaging a group that would never normally be able to come away from the day job and share, even given they were mainly in the same office. And of course, problem solving. We all have problems, and solving problems as quickly as possible is a good thing to do. So a real range of different types of challenges that companies are addressing. So what's the lessons here? Well, what I would say is that services companies spend more time innovating the business than the product, of course, but they are still doing both. And if I draw the correlation, again, product, competency, capability, what we are selling. They do have a much wider range of use cases than we see within the product innovation space, but they're just as important. Now you may say, well, yeah, but it's what you sell that really is the value driver for an organization. That is the core of the business. Is there really significant value in innovating outside of the product or the competency or the thing that we sell? Well, I'd like to look at some research from Dublin. Some of you may have seen this before. It's a few years old now, but I think it still resonates really well with me. This represents where organizations put their innovation efforts. What's the quantity of innovation effort in the different areas where potentially we could innovate? So focusing primarily on the innovation world here as opposed to the efficiency space. And what you can see is four big buckets: strategy, process, offering, and delivery. And of course, as you'd expect, many organizations put an awful lot of effort into product performance, product system, and the service around the product. Now, if we then correlate that, and I think this is great insight to where innovation value is created, it's almost the inverse of the graph we just saw. So you can see huge amounts of value created in the strategy space, in the process space, and even in the customer engagement space. And I want to use Fujitsu as a really nice example in a moment about engaging customers in terms of improving and deriving value from that part of the puzzle. So yes, there is value, of course, in the product and the offering, but we see an awful lot of innovation value outside of that space. And of course, for services companies, this is a much broader set of conversations that they can get involved with. So let's look at some of those examples. I've got 4 prepared for you from different sectors, really just to try and illustrate a few different points that I've been making as we've gone through, and also show with you what some of the newer clients to Hype are actually addressing. So most of these organizations have been working with us for less than a couple of years. So let's look at Fujitsu. For those of you who don't know, it's an IT services company. They're in the tens of thousands of employees across Europe, owned by the big Fujitsu IT company in Japan. And they typically will deliver IT projects, IT services, outsourcing solutions for big, complex organizations in both the private and public sector. And what they found is that they weren't necessarily close enough to the customer. They were delivering the core contract, they were delivering, be it the network managed service or the outsourced desktop solution, but they weren't really at the heart of their customer's business. They weren't understanding what the core business challenges were for their customers. So they established something called the Activate program, and I'd like to credit Joe Box and Eleanor Tong at Fujitsu for establishing this. So great examples of what you can do in the open innovation space, which I'll come back to in a second. They established this Activate program, which was really using these online campaigns to tap into the collective insight of their customers on their core business needs. And they went back to their customers and said, look, we're not going to bring to you things to sell. We will have long-term relationships with you, working with you over many years. What we want to do is understand your business better. We understand your business problems better. Tell us your business problems. Allow us to tap into the collective insight of your employees. And then we will go away and tap into the collective insight of our employees and come back to you with a solution to your problem, not just something that we want to sell. And they've rolled out this program to their 60 UK clients. It's now being rolled out across the world, in Australia and Spain and other countries, because the customer's perspective is that this is really making a difference. They're changing the way in which they're interacting with their customers and coming up with genuinely new capabilities on the back of actually listening much more widely and using these collective insight principles to do that listening. So a really great example. Now, if we can talk about Fujitsu, I can talk about Fujitsu all day, so if you're interested more in that example, we can perhaps schedule a separate conversation, or even you can talk to them yourselves. Let's turn to the other side of the Atlantic from where I am today. I'm based in just outside of London. My friends at UC San Diego. So this is a university, and it's a really pretty large university with over 30,000 students. and one of the top 15 research universities worldwide. Now, UC San Diego have been working with this program for a little over 18 months now, and this was all initiated out of a new set of strategic goals contributed to by about 10,000 different representatives across campus, really looking at the future of the university and how to become more student-centered. And they've been running crowdsourcing campaigns primarily to look at a whole range of different topics, including how the organization should grow, how it should attract more funding, how it should attract more students, how it can address a rapid pace of change within the higher education sector. Education certainly won't look the same in 10, 20 years as it does today, and they're trying to make sure they're out in front of that. How they can be more efficient as an organization and take away the red tape and the stumbling blocks that we all exist and experience in our companies. And how they can deal with what is quite a distributed workforce, a large campus and people traveling a fair amount as well worldwide. So they've been running campaigns on things like reducing administration, improving recruitment processes, and engaging students on local campus-wide issues like how do we make our parking solution a little bit better. And I'd like to credit Bob Newhart at UC San Diego, who's been establishing a really great program. He spoke again at our forum in Bonn this year. And, you know, this is one of the first universities that we've seen really go to town with establishing an effective program. Other universities have dipped their toes in, but not yet has higher education really embraced this. But I think that's beginning to start to change. If you ever get a chance to hear Bob or people from UC San Diego talking about that program, I strongly recommend you getting a good listen, because they also have really strong connections to the commercial sector. They're a big research organization and funding coming from all kinds of different places, and a real great wealth of knowledge and insights to be tapped into. And they've only just started. They've really got some very exciting things ahead. So a bit of a change of company, GfK. This is a market research company, fifth largest market research company in the world. And they have a really fast changing competitive landscape. I'm quite passionate about GfK because my very first job was in market research, writing questions, writing surveys for commercial organizations. And I've seen the sort of the 20-year journey of where market research has been and where it's going. It's a really fast-changing competitive landscape. Digitalization is a big thing for them. Looking at data sources is a huge area for them. And simply the established business shape is under threat. So this is a circumstance where the organization has a compelling reason to have to change, to adapt itself under some significant pressures. And what they're doing is undergoing a transformation from being solely data collectors to actually mediators of different data sources. So actually really looking at what's out there, how it can be exploited for the purposes of getting greater insights. So they're using idea campaigns, again, mainly at the front end, again, and we'll come back to that topic. But they're using these idea campaigns to find new business ideas that are then pitched to senior management for funding, for seed funding, potential new capabilities. So real focus on core competency again, and using the collective insight of their employees to resolve that. Okay, and I'd like to credit Michael and Poonam from GfK, who again are a really exciting team at GfK doing some really interesting stuff. So one final example, pretty different. This is coming from the insurance, or actually the reinsurance sector, Munich Re. And this is an example from Munich Re's American business. It's a market where differentiation is very difficult. And again, they've only relatively recently started their program. Companies in this sector are not big adopters of collaborative innovation programs, but we need to see that change. And one of the things that Munich Re have done, of course, is to establish a new team focused on developing new capabilities. And I love this example because I think it has sort of really great societal merits. I wanted to share it with you. They ran an initial campaign focused on a really complex group of stakeholders looking at the challenges associated with school bus safety. So Munich Re, as an insurer, is insuring school buses right across the United States, and unfortunately sees the consequences of injuries and fatalities involving school buses on too regular basis. So instead of just sitting by, they decided to try and get ahead of this and see if we can innovate to be able to solve this societal challenge, and in the process, of course, begin to build up a new business model. So what they looked for is, could we create new technical solutions, match to different use cases of sensors, alerting school bus drivers to where perhaps children were in the way and out of view. And they want to combine expertise from people that, general public, from insurance brokers, from their own employees, from technology providers, startups, anybody that felt they had something to say. And they're in the process of looking at this and rolling out some pilot programs to really address the problem, which is fascinating. Not only is there a big societal benefit here, they're also beginning to change the shape of their business, selling a product, not just a service. So again, a blurring of those lines. So if you're a service company, where would you start? What are the different starting points that you might look to address? Well, I think let's just take a sanity check here for a minute, because although I'm sure many of you see the benefits of implementing these collective insight programs, organizations without that sort of product innovation in their DNA are going to respond differently to the challenge of innovation. And in many cases, the word innovation may cause some concerns. It may be perceived to be risky. I've talked to many financial services organizations, and often they say, well, actually, we want to be risk averse. We want to be a safe pair of hands. I talked to building contractors, organizations that build big projects, and they say, actually, innovation in our world is a dirty word. Yes, we want to be better, but innovation is perceived to be risky. So you have to accept the culture that you have, not, of course, try and create the culture that you want overnight. And part of that is to work out what's the right wrapper for your program. And the one I quite like is collective insight with purpose. Yes, you can apply the collective insight of your employees onto innovation challenges or onto efficiency challenges or anywhere where you have a collaboration problem. But just bear in mind that innovation might not be useful to you in terms of getting people engaged and excited about the potential of working together. Of course, there are two major areas of focus for any company. There's the new and differentiated capabilities, but there's also the efficiency aspect. And I'd like to try and correlate what we've been talking about so far with this innovation process. So as I said, this is a fairly standard innovation funnel, and the way it's designed, at least within our application, is you can step in and out of that funnel at a time that suits you. So you don't necessarily need to go through the whole workflow. So let's break it down. And let's look at the correlation. So if we look at strategic innovation areas, in a product company, that will be essentially a set of different sectors or different markets or different products that we want to investigate. This is a governance level. It's basically illustrating to the organization which areas we want to innovate and where we want to share. But every company has big topics to address, and service companies are no different. So the usage of these strategic innovation areas or these focused areas are very little different between services and product companies. So let's move on to idea campaigns. I think there is a big difference here in how these are used. In a product company, in many cases, these are being used to create new products, and they're being used strategically within the innovation world. But in many cases, in services companies, yes, they are being used strategically, like the example we just heard from with Munich Re or with GfK, but they're also being used tactically to listen, to understand, to share best practice, to reduce cost, to be more efficient. And the ideas generated here will not progress further and deeper into the workflow. They will be addressable at the end of that selection phase. So I think there's a much broader set of use cases that exist within services companies, and of course product companies could benefit from those use cases as well, but in terms of what we see, the weight of energy and effort is primarily broader within service companies. And often many service companies are simply just running idea campaigns and doing nothing else around this workflow. Let's move on to concepts. Concepts are used very heavily within the product innovation space. In fact, as I mentioned really early on, many companies are just doing innovation concept management. So they have many ideas, many rounded concepts, but they want to make sure they're making the best decisions, where to invest, what's likely to give us the best bang for our buck over a given time frame. And so this process here is very critical for a product company. As we talked about with, say, pharmaceuticals, you want to make sure that you're putting your energy into the right parts of your innovation portfolio, because it's very expensive if you find you're going to make mistakes or invest in time in products that are never going to make it. Now, in a services environment, for some cases this is still useful. I think much less so, but it is still useful, particularly if you are trying to build business cases or justify investment. If you have multiple different options that may require resources and money before they're implemented, then of course you are going to want to make sure that your decision making is good. Yes, it will be less expensive than it would be in, say, a big aerospace or auto company, but still, we don't want to just waste our time. So anywhere where there is constraints around resources, money, needed to justify investment decisions, then this concept phase, I think, is still certainly useful for services companies, although I do accept it's much less of an impact than if you're in the product space. And then finally, projects, and I think certainly we see very few services companies using this part of the workflow. Yes, of course, many companies will care about ROI, tracking and benefits, but in terms of regular usage, I think in many cases this is still a very product company type feature and function, and I sort of take it up from the level of the software in terms of energy that goes into innovation projects is certainly much more significant in the product space. So if we would just touch on the campaign space as we count down our time, given that's the most heavily adopted part of the workflow, let's dig into that a little bit more for our last few slides, and let's look at where campaigns are most commonly used within service companies and look at something called different campaign modes. Now, for those of you who joined my last webinar on culture change and change management, you'll remember this: 5 major different modes for campaigns. This is typically how they're used. I'll just explain each of them. So there's the creative mode, using diverse opinions, collaborating together to develop something that doesn't yet exist. So that would be a great example of GFK running their campaigns to create new capabilities. Problem solving, so using collective insight and diverse opinions to fix a known issue. So the example we gave from Equinity of improving the processes around their call centers would be a good example of that. Discovery is quite an interesting one. This is where we're looking for rare expertise from the corners of the organization, ideas and insights. We know they're out there, we just don't know where they are. And we cast a big net to try and gather what will be a relatively small amount of submissions from quite a large group potentially. Testing is a really interesting use case. We've seen this used, I think there's an example quoted from Interserve at our last forum, where they looked at their healthcare business. They wanted to implement a new communications policy, but before they did so, they actually put it out for discussion and debate with their community and said, we were thinking about doing this, what do you think? Can it be improved? Can it be developed? And of course, people really valued the fact they had an opportunity to contribute to a change before it happened, so it didn't feel so imposed upon them. And not only did they get a better process, they also got a much slicker adoption of that process later on. And finally, feedback. So getting feedback from the people out there in the field on what we're doing already so that we can improve. So these are the 5 major campaign modes that we see. And these are certainly a good way of thinking when it comes to adopting these sorts of processes. And of course, they can be grouped into either the efficiency or the innovation world, depending on what your area of focus is. And this is just a slice of what we would share. If you're a hype client, just let me know, email myself or Mitch from marketing, and we can send you the full list of use case examples in these 2 sectors. So if you think you're a services company and you're thinking, where should we start, how can we get people involved, think about where the culture is, what it's likely to be, what's likely to be palatable, and in many cases that might be problem solving initially and moving towards the creative space as we progress. And I said, if you want to know more about how these are applied in practical terms and adapting to culture, just take a look at that change management approach webinar that we ran a month or 2 back. So just to summarize, we need to get away from this concept of that innovation equals the invention or creation of things. I think services companies absolutely benefit from innovating and using collective expertise tools just as much as a product company. But yes, the use cases are a little different. The energy goes into different places. And I think that in many cases the adoption will feel different. And it will be more tactical across different parts of the business as opposed to focusing purely on the big strategic capability generation. And for many companies, the pace of change that we're all exposed to now is a big driver for doing this. We're exposed in terms of regulation, in terms of changing political and geographical circumstances. We are exposed to new competitors that we've never seen before from emerging markets, and all of this affects all kinds of different companies in different ways. So having a big utility of people and making that our greatest asset and tapping into that even more, of course, is a great thing to do. So I hope you found this useful. Certainly an enjoyable topic for me to talk about. As we come to the end, I'd like to take any questions that are out there. So if you have any questions, feel free just to put them into the little question box, and we will follow up on them. As I mentioned, any questions that you have sort of just more generically about Hype, feel free to put them in there anyway, although we might not have time to address them today. So let me deal with the first question I have here, which is, do you see service companies building up concept portfolios like product companies do? Well, yeah, I guess I touched on this briefly, but not in a great amount of detail. Product companies, of course, generate new concepts much more regularly. That's their sort of primary use case in many ways, looking at developing new products. Now, service companies, we do see it happening, but obviously at a much lower level of energy, and it tends to be much less frequently. So perhaps the distinction I'd make is that service companies are doing it once from time to time when they feel like they need new capabilities, whereas product companies are doing it all the time. So often it's the product companies that have the big concept portfolios that are really curating and looking at in terms of strategic investment decisions, and the product companies probably do it from time to time when necessary. All right, let's take a look at other questions we have here. So thanks so much for you that are sharing some. All right, great. So another question here we have, do service companies see engaging external groups differently than product companies? Okay, so good, great question. Where does open innovation fit in? I think that what we're seeing is that service companies tend to be more inclined to engage with external communities more regularly using collective insight tools than product companies. And my assumptions around why that is are twofold. I think one of it is there's an acceptance within service companies that people are a great asset, and the fact that all the best people don't necessarily work for us. So, and we can harnessing value from people outside of our organization can, of course, be translated into business value for us. I think that's a really widely accepted concept in the services companies. They seem to be pretty natural partners, of course. I think the other aspect, which I think is more of a blocker perspective, is service companies are less worried about intellectual property in many cases compared to product company. Now, I'm drawing some broad generalizations here. I could give examples of both sectors where that's not true, but just in general terms, less worried about intellectual property, less worried about innovating with partners than exists within a product company. So yes, I would say that certainly going externally is perceived differently, and in many cases I see services companies doing it more often. I think Fujitsu would be a great example of that, of probably one of the largest business-to-business open innovation programs, business-to-business customer open innovation programs there is out there. All right, great. So any final questions here? What's the best approach, prototypes, and new services? Well, that's a tough one, Tom. I think I need to go into more detail with you than I can have time to deal with today. Any final questions? I think we're coming to the end, Mitch. All right. Great. So unless there are any final questions that come in the last minute or so, I think, Mitch, we can draw things to a close.